Today, when people think of England, they think of the royal family, London, Shakespeare, the Industrial Revolution, and a vast empire that once stretched across the world. But England did not emerge onto the stage of history as a strong and unified state. On the contrary, these lands remained the center of migrations, invasions, civil wars, and struggles for the throne for thousands of years. The Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, and the Normans all arrived here in succession. Each left behind a piece of its own language, culture, and way of life. So how did this small country in northwestern Europe become one of the most influential states to shape world history? The story of England begins long before there was even a country called England. Until the end of the last ice age, Britain was not an island. Between what is now England and mainland Europe lay a vast landmass known as Doggerland. Humans and animals could travel from Europe to Britain across this land. Around 11,000 years ago, as the glaciers melted, sea levels rose. Doggerland gradually disappeared beneath the sea, separating Britain from the European continent and turning it into an island. However, the rising seas did not completely cut Britain's ties with Europe. Around 4000 BC, agriculture reached Britain. People began transitioning from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to settled communities. Villages were established, and monumental tombs and massive stone structures, such as Stonehenge, were built. Over the following centuries, new groups arriving from Europe brought different languages and cultures. These cultures gradually became part of the Celtic world, which influenced much of Western Europe. The Celtic peoples lived on these lands for hundreds of years, until Roman armies appeared on the horizon. In 55 BC, Julius Caesar, one of Rome's most famous commanders, landed on the southern coast of Britain. During his first expedition, he failed to establish permanent control. A year later, he returned with a larger army, but once again he could not completely conquer the island. The true conquest of Britain began nearly a century later in AD 43, during the reign of Emperor Claudius. Roman legions advanced step by step, taking control of much of what is now England. Important cities such as London, York, and Chester flourished during the Roman period. Roads, forts, baths, and trading centers were built. Of course, there were those who resisted Roman rule. In AD 60, Queen Boudica led a major rebellion. The rebels managed to destroy several Roman settlements, but in the end the Roman army prevailed. After that, England remained part of the Roman Empire for several centuries. The empire's northern frontier was protected by Hadrian's Wall, built to defend against attacks from what is now Scotland. But Rome's power did not last forever. In the early 5th century, the empire weakened due to invasions and internal problems across Europe. In AD 407, the last Roman legions withdrew from Britain. With the departure of the Romans, a major power vacuum emerged, and it did not take long for new peoples to arrive and fill that vacuum. These were the Germanic peoples we know today as the Anglo-Saxons. Exactly how the Anglo-Saxons settled in Britain is still debated. Some historians believe there was a large-scale invasion in which the native Celtic population was pushed westward. Others argue that the settlement happened more gradually and that the newcomers slowly blended with the local population. But the outcome was clear. Roman culture was gradually replaced by the Anglo-Saxon language, traditions, and system of government. The foundations of modern English were also laid during this period. The Anglo-Saxons did not establish a single country. Instead, separate kingdoms emerged across different parts of England, including East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex. These kingdoms sometimes united, but more often they fought one another. Originally pagan, the Anglo-Saxons gradually converted to Christianity in the following centuries. monasteries were established, written records began to be kept, and a new cultural order emerged in England. But toward the end of the 8th century, a new threat appeared along the coasts. The Vikings, arriving in their long, narrow ships. The attack on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 is considered the symbolic beginning of the Viking Age in England. At first, the Vikings landed on the coast, plundered wealthy monasteries, and quickly returned home. But in 865 their strategy changed. A large Viking force, referred to in Anglo-Saxon sources as the Great Heathen Army, landed in England. This time the goal was not merely to seize treasure, but to conquer land and settle there. Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia quickly fell. Only the Kingdom of Wessex remained. The King of Wessex, Alfred, tried to stop the Vikings, sometimes through battle, sometimes by paying them tribute. But by 878, most of his kingdom had been occupied, and Alfred was forced into hiding. The future of England now depended on a single battle. Alfred gathered his loyal soldiers once more and confronted the Viking army at the Battle of Edington. He won. This victory not only saved Wessex, but also laid the foundation for the future unification of England. The Vikings retreated eastward, and the territory they controlled became known as the Danelaw. The kings of Wessex, who followed Alfred, gradually reclaimed the lands held by the Vikings. Alfred's grandson Athelstan captured York in 927 and for the first time proclaimed himself King of the English. Thus England began to unite under the rule of a single monarch for the first time. But the Viking threat had not completely disappeared. At the beginning of the 11th century, the English throne passed back and forth between Anglo-Saxon and Danish rulers. For a time, England became part of the vast North Sea Empire ruled by King Canute. In 1042, the House of Wessex returned to the throne with Edward the Confessor. However, Edward had no children. When he died in 1066, more than one man claimed the English throne. The English nobleman Harold Godwinson was proclaimed king, but Harold Hardrada, king of Norway, and William, Duke of Normandy, also claimed that the crown rightfully belonged to them. First, the Norwegians invaded. Harold Godwinson marched north with his army and defeated Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But immediately after this victory, news arrived from the south. William, Duke of Normandy, had landed on the English coast with his army. Harold's exhausted army was forced to march south at once. On October 14, 1066, the two sides met at the Battle of Hastings. By the end of the battle, Harold had been killed, and the era of the Anglo-Saxon kings came to an end. William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day. History would later remember him as William the Conqueror. The Norman conquest fundamentally transformed England. Most of the Anglo-Saxon nobility was removed from power and replaced by Norman aristocrats. French became the language of the ruling class. For centuries, English, French, and Latin influenced one another. William also ordered a great survey known as the Domesday Book to record the country's lands, population, and wealth. The Norman nobles also owned lands in France. As a result, England's future became much more closely tied to France. After the Norman dynasty, Henry II ascended the throne, marking the beginning of the Plantagenet era. In addition to England, Henry II controlled vast territories in western France. However, in the years that followed, the English kings lost most of their lands in France. As the cost of war increased, tensions between the king and the nobility continued to grow. In 1215, King John was forced to accept the Magna Carta under pressure from the rebelling barons. This document did not completely eliminate the king's powers. However, it strengthened the idea that even the monarch was subject to the law, becoming one of the most important turning points in England's constitutional development. Toward the end of the 13th century, Edward I strengthened the central government, contributed to the development of Parliament, and conquered Wales. He also attempted to bring Scotland under his control, but encountered much stronger resistance there. In the 14th century, the 100 Years' War began between England and France. English armies achieved major victories at battles such as Crécy and Poitiers, but at that very moment, an enemy far deadlier than swords reached England's shores. In 1348, the Black Death entered the country. Within less than 2 years, the plague had spread across nearly all of England, killing a large portion of the population. Villages were abandoned, production declined, and the workforce shrank. As the surviving peasants demanded higher wages, the government increased taxes to cover the costs of war. This tension eventually erupted into the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The rebels marched all the way to London, but the uprising was eventually suppressed. Political instability in England continued. During the reign of Henry V, the English won a great victory over France at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. But after Henry died at a young age, the course of the war changed. By 1453, England had lost almost all of its territories in France. Defeats abroad only intensified the struggle for the throne at home. In 1455, the Wars of the Roses began between the houses of York and Lancaster. This conflict between the White Rose and the Red Rose lasted for nearly 30 years. Finally, in 1485, Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. With Henry's accession to the throne and his marriage to Elizabeth of York, the two rival dynasties were united. England's long medieval era was coming to an end. The Tudor period was beginning. The first king of the Tudor dynasty, Henry VII, brought a period of relative stability to the country after years of civil war. The economy, damaged by years of conflict, began to recover. The ideas of the Renaissance spreading across Europe reached England. A new era began in art, education, and government. But one of the greatest transformations in English history would take place under Henry VII's son. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, his reign initially appeared promising. He was seen as a young, educated, and powerful king. But over time his rule became increasingly harsh. The main reason was his desire to produce a male heir. From his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, only one daughter survived, Mary. Henry wanted to end the marriage, but the Pope refused to grant the annulment. In response, Henry separated England from the authority of the Catholic Church and established the Church of England with the king as its head. This decision did more than end a marriage. It completely transformed England's religious and political structure. A long period of tension between Catholics and Protestants began throughout the country. Henry's later marriages were also highly turbulent. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, gave birth to a daughter named Elizabeth, but was later executed. His third wife, Jane Seymour, died shortly after giving birth to the long-awaited son Henry had wanted for years, Edward. His fourth marriage ended in divorce. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was executed. His sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, outlived Henry. When Henry VIII died in 1547, his only son, Edward VI, succeeded him. During Edward's reign, England became an even more Protestant nation. However, the young king's reign did not last long. He died in 1553. The throne then passed to his half-sister Mary. Mary was a devout Catholic and wanted to reverse the Protestant reforms initiated by her father. To achieve this, she imposed severe persecution on Protestants. The burning of approximately 280 people led to her being remembered in history as Bloody Mary. Mary had no children, and when she died in 1558, the throne passed to her half-sister Elizabeth. The reign of Elizabeth I is considered one of the brightest ages in English history. The Protestant Church of England was re-established, the central government was strengthened, and the country's population grew significantly. Art and literature flourished. William Shakespeare wrote the plays that are still regarded today as some of the world's greatest theatrical works during this period. But Elizabeth's reign was not remembered only for its cultural achievements. England was also becoming an increasingly powerful nation at sea. Sailors such as Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh launched expeditions toward the Americas and Asia. Trade networks expanded, and England's interest in overseas territories increased. This rise created a major rivalry with Spain, one of the most powerful states of the time. In 1588, Spain sent a massive fleet to invade England. Known as the Spanish Armada, the fleet suffered a devastating defeat due to English attacks and severe weather. This victory became one of the defining moments symbolizing England's rise as a naval power. However, Elizabeth never married and had no children. When she died in 1603, the Tudor dynasty came to an end. The English throne passed to James VI of Scotland, who also became James I of England. Thus England and Scotland came under the rule of the same monarch. However, the two countries were not yet a single state. They retained their own parliaments, laws, and political systems. One of the most remarkable events during James's early reign was the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. A group of Catholics attempted to kill the king and members of Parliament by blowing up the Parliament building. The plan failed, but it demonstrated just how strong religious tensions remained within the country. During the same period, the English established their first permanent settlements in America and India. These small trading posts and colonies became the first steps toward what would later grow into the British Empire. But a new crisis was growing within the country. The king and parliament increasingly clashed over who truly held power. This conflict reached its breaking point during the reign of Charles I, the son of James I. Charles believed that the king should possess broad powers and refused to cooperate with Parliament. Disagreements over taxation, religion, and the governance of the state continued to deepen. Eventually, in 1642, the English Civil War began. On one side were the Royalists, loyal to the king. On the other were the Roundheads, who supported Parliament. The country became a battlefield for years. Battles such as Edgehill, Marston Moor, and Naseby determined the outcome of the conflict. The parliamentary army, led by Oliver Cromwell, emerged victorious. King Charles I was captured, put on trial, and executed in 1649. The trial and execution of an English king by his own people was an event that deeply shocked Europe. The monarchy was abolished, and England briefly became a republic. The government of the country largely fell into the hands of Oliver Cromwell. However, after Cromwell's death, the system could not survive. In 1660, the monarchy was restored, and Charles II returned to England and ascended the throne. The king had returned, but he no longer possessed his former absolute power. Moreover, the country had not yet fully recovered from the wounds of the Civil War. In 1665, London was struck by a devastating outbreak of plague. A year later, the Great Fire of London broke out. The fire destroyed a large portion of the city. Although these disasters caused enormous destruction, they also paved the way for London to be rebuilt in a more organized and safer manner. After the death of Charles II, his brother James II ascended the throne. However, James's Catholic faith and fears that he intended to return England to Catholicism created a new political crisis. English leaders invited James's Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange to England. In 1688, William landed in England with an army. James II fled to France without offering serious resistance. This transfer of power, which took place without a large-scale civil war, became known in history as the Glorious Revolution. William and Mary began ruling England together. In 1689 they accepted the Bill of Rights. This document further limited the king's powers and strengthened the supremacy of Parliament. Thus the foundations of constitutional monarchy in England were firmly established. From that point onward, the king could no longer rule the country alone with unlimited authority. In 1707, the parliaments of England and Scotland were united. The two separate kingdoms became a single political entity under the name Kingdom of Great Britain. From this point forward, the history of England became increasingly intertwined with the history of Britain. During the 18th century, expanding trade, the powerful Royal Navy, and overseas colonies made Britain one of the world's leading naval powers. Trade networks across the Americas, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia continued to expand. However, this rise was not uninterrupted. The American colonies rebelled in pursuit of independence, and Britain lost these territories at the end of the American Revolutionary War. This defeat was a major blow to Britain's prestige. Nevertheless, Britain's global rise did not stop. At home, supporters of the exiled House of Stuart launched uprisings against the government in 1715 and 1745. These movements, known as the Jacobite rebellions, failed, and the existing monarchy retained its power. The truly great transformation, however, began toward the end of the 18th century. The Industrial Revolution transformed England from an agricultural society into a nation of factories, machines, and great cities. Developments in steam power, textile manufacturing, coal mining, and the iron industry increased production on an unprecedented scale. Cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool expanded rapidly. Railways connected every corner of the country. But this progress also came at a heavy cost. Long working hours in factories, child labor, poor living conditions, and rapidly overcrowded cities created serious social problems. Even so, the economic and technological power generated by the Industrial Revolution made Britain the world's greatest global power during the 19th century. The British Empire expanded across the globe. At one point, a vast portion of the world's population and territory was under British rule. The British Navy dominated the seas, while British trade connected distant regions of the world. However, this empire did not grow through trade and technology alone. Military conquests, colonial rule, the exploitation of local resources, and the slave trade were also deeply intertwined with its rise. By the 20th century, Britain was still a powerful nation, but the two world wars severely weakened its economic and military strength. The First World War caused enormous human losses and left the country burdened with heavy debt. During the Second World War, England became one of the main centers of resistance against Nazi Germany. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, the German Air Force attempted to force the country into surrender, but failed. Britain emerged as one of the victorious nations of the war. But the cost of victory was immense. The country was economically exhausted, and managing its vast empire was becoming increasingly difficult. After the war, many colonies, most notably India, gained their independence. Within a few decades, the British Empire had largely dissolved. England was no longer the world's single dominant power. However, the political, economic, and cultural systems it had built over centuries left a lasting impact on the world. When we look at England today, we can see traces of this long history everywhere. In Roman roads, in Anglo-Saxon place names, in words inherited from the Vikings, in Norman castles, in the tradition of Parliament, in the industrial cities, and of course in the English language. Modern English is not a pure language created by a single people. It was formed through centuries of interaction between Latin, the Germanic language of the Anglo-Saxons, the Old Norse of the Vikings, and the French of the Normans. Perhaps that is exactly what best tells the story of England. This country changed continuously throughout history. It was invaded, divided, reunited, and transformed itself again and again. What began as the story of a small island nation off the coast of Europe eventually became the story of a power that influenced much of the world. England's identity today is not the work of a single king, a single battle, or a single people. It is the combination of thousands of years of migration, conflict, ideas, and cultures. And perhaps the most important truth about the history of England is this: the country's greatest strength has never been that it never changed. It has been its ability to rebuild itself after every great change. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories from history. See you in the next documentary.